All right, looks like we're live. Hi, I have just put my rice on for my lunch, so I figure it's going to take about a half hour to get that all done and sorted. Usually takes me about a half hour to do my rice for lunch, so I figured I would hash out this question while my food is cooking. So. Maybe some of you saw this, but a couple days ago I did a presentation on Facebook Live where I asked the question, what is Eastern philosophy? And I sort of explored, why the concept Eastern is sort of a little bit problematic and how and then sort of how we might rethink that term to be more inclusive and to represent those traditions that are seeking to shift or illuminate our perspective on reality. And then what was great about that is that we had an opportunity to ask questions both during the presentation and then afterwards. I received some comments and some questions to my email, to the email address hello@embodiedphilosophy.com. And one of our community members asked about the idea of religion and had remarked how I hadn't really touched much on the idea of religion, which is obviously a very important topic because most people, when they think of Eastern philosophy, they think of religion, and it's often Eastern philosophy and Eastern religion are often used interchangeably. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that today, and actually I'm really enjoying this kind of back and forth, and I would love for these lives to become kind of an exchange where I do my best to explain an idea and unpack it in the best way that I can. And then you as the community, if you have questions or there are areas that I sort of brush over or I don't really, or there's a problem with my argument or, you have an objection to something I bring up, I would love for you to share that in the comments, or you can send it to hello@embodiedphilosophy.com and we can just make this kind of an ongoing conversation in a way. And these presentations can all be inspired by the questions that you have, the community of embodied philosophy. So please, over the course of this talk, if you have any questions, write them down, jot them down, or you can put them right into the comments section. And then when I get to the end of the presentation, I'm going to look at my phone and see if there are any comments or any questions in the comments, and then I'll answer them then, and we can sort of have a sort of live conversation. But if you're watching this, obviously, after it airs live, then you can send those. You could write it in the comments. I'll still get those comments, those questions, but you could also send it a personal email to hello@embodiedphilosophy.com. Okay. So just to introduce myself, my name is Jacob Kyle. If you're new to Embodied Philosophy, I'm the founder and director of embodiedphilosophy.com, which is an online platform for Eastern philosophies and practices, yoga, meditation, and pranayama, and all of the above, really. So if you haven't checked out the website, you can check out embodiedphilosophy.com or 5tattvas.com. It has the same, it's at the same, it'll send you to the same place. Okay. So, Eastern wisdom, is it philosophy or is it religion? My question or my answer to this question is going to be both and neither. That might be maybe sort of a frustrating answer, but I hope it'll become clear as I sort of explore this. So first I want to start with the neither. I want to say that Eastern wisdom is neither religion or philosophy, but only in a certain way of understanding what religion and philosophy is. So let's start with religion. So religion, if we look at this concept historically, it actually emerged in the 19th century, in the time that we call in Western history the Enlightenment. And it arose, the concept developed as science started to separate itself and see itself as distinct from what it started to call religious ideas. And so science, originally actually, the scientific practice was embedded in notions of the divine, and if we go back to the earliest times in Plato's time in ancient Greece, we see that it's not so easy to distinguish the scientific enterprise from what might be seen as religious now. So historically, in this period of the Enlightenment, which is specifically a Western point in history, religion became a concept that was used to describe and to understand specifically things related to Christianity, especially since Christianity was the dominant paradigm of religion in the West, but also Judaism and to a certain extent Islam. And what we know about all of these religions is that they posit a transcendent creator God. They posit a Godhead that is other than the world, is other than the material realm. So science started to separate itself from theology or religion in establishing itself in the material realm, whereas religion was said to be concerned with things that were other than the world, or things that were transcendent to the world. So this kind of character of religion then, as the kind of academic scholarship of religion started to develop, then it was sort of like, okay, well, how can we expand this category to make sense of what we might see as religion in other cultures? Or how can we understand what appears as religious to us, and how can we see the common threads that would determine whether or not something is a religion? So the category of religion was imposed upon of a wide variety of practices and traditions of other cultures as an attempt to understand the commonality of all of these things that we were loosely putting under the category of religion. So there was a certain sense of a kind of forcing into the confines of this category all of these things that we might say are very unique and maybe don't fit so easily into that category. One of these examples would be Hinduism, for example. So if you were to approach, a Hindu with this term religion, because it's so embedded in their daily understanding of reality, it smacks up against them as sort of a problematic term. And so the concept of religion emerged with Enlightenment rationality as science began to separate itself from Christianity. And so the term religion is sort of saturated with this historical association with particularly Christianity. And then in deploying the term religion, we were seeking, behind the diversity of practices that we can actually see in the world, we were seeking through the imposition of that concept, at least traditionally, and of course religion departments are not so, they're much more diverse now and they're much more sensitive to this topic. In imposing that category on a variety of different traditions, we were seeking to find some kind of thread of commonality in what were actually very diverse approaches to ritual and approaches to practices that would align oneself to a certain way of perceiving and acting and connecting with the world around us. So often when someone asks the question, is it religious now, we often see someone as using that in order to establish themselves on one or the other side of it. Either they want to be a religious person and so they want to place themselves on the side of what they might call religion, or it's used as a kind of derogatory term that is associated with those kind of backward religious people, and so religion, in the kind of, especially somebody who would consider themselves atheist or agnostic, religion is often something that someone is trying to separate themselves from. So ascribing religion to something like Eastern wisdom could maybe be problematic because it denies how very different some of these Eastern traditions are from what in the West we would call religion. So, for example, as I mentioned before, religions in Islam and Judaism and in Christianity are positing a transcendent creator God that is that is other and transcendent to the world. Well, we don't find this in some traditions, particularly Buddhism. In Buddhism, there is no transcendent creator God. There is no absolute reality in the Buddhist philosophy. So, in what sense then can we call Buddhism a religion if it lacks the very deity that actually grounds what most people consider religion? How is it appropriate to use that term to capture it, to really understand it? Isn't it a distortion to use a term to understand something that doesn't have what many people would consider central to the very notion of religion, which is the idea of a transcendent God, up there in the clouds somewhere? Also, there are traditions that say that God is not transcendent, but is immanent to reality. So many of these traditions, particularly Shaivism, is trying to get us to see that Shiva is in fact everything. Shiva, for example, is the word that describes or points to the supreme consciousness of which we are all a part. So we are all permeated with this absolute consciousness, which we call Shiva, and we are not separate from that. Therefore, there is nothing that is transcendent to, at least from a certain perspective. Of course, there are a variety of different Shaivite traditions, so I don't want to pretend like they're all saying the same thing, because they certainly aren't. And we see this across traditions, even within Buddhism, within Shaivism, within yoga, within Vedanta. There's many points of view that sometimes conflict on all of these topics. So I don't mean to imply that that I am describing something that is continuous across all of these different approaches. So just to sort of offer that as a disclaimer, but there are approaches to Shaivism, for example, which see that divine is an immanent thing. God is something that's immanent, and what we're looking to experience is a shift in our perception so that we can understand the interconnectedness of all things, and we can understand that we are not separate from that absolute interconnectedness that we might call Shiva. So this is a very different religion from the religion of Christianity, for example, that sees God as transcendent too, and God has many, moral ideas about this, that, and the other thing. And so how is it appropriate to call all of these things religion? So that's sort of a way that we might problematize and say, if religion is a conception is a term that is hinged upon a notion of God that is transcendent to the material realm and transcendent to our experience, then I want to say that Eastern wisdom, in the way that we try to unpack it at Embodied Philosophy, is not religion. Okay? So now let's talk about philosophy, and then I'll come back to religion in a second. So philosophy also is a practice that is particularly Western. The term philosophy arose in ancient Greece. Philosophia, the love of wisdom, is semantically what it means. And while I love the semantic term, and I think that's really the heart of philosophy for me, and hopefully for our community, but it is also the term used for a purely rational practice of critical inquiry that has been, one might say, monopolized by the academic institutions. And so philosophy is often used as to refer to a purely intellectualized practice that is not an embodied practice. So if philosophy, this is a much shorter analysis of philosophy than I offered for religion, but if philosophy is merely understood to be a rational intellectual practice that has no kind of ritual or embodied or practical component besides the practice of logical argumentation, then I want to say no. Eastern wisdom is not purely a philosophy. So now according to these kind of prevailing understandings or very common understandings of what philosophy and religion are, Eastern wisdom does not quite fit. Okay? So, but if we were to look at religion, for example, as something different, for example, so I mentioned Hinduism before. If someone was to say, I am not interested in religion, or I am not a religious person, this is something that doesn't make sense in other cultural climates. For example, in Hindu cultures, to say I'm not interested in religion is akin to saying I am not interested in life, because the intimacy with something that might be considered divine is so close at hand to certain cultures that it makes no sense. It literally cannot be conceived of to separate the divine from the material and embodied lived experience. And again, this separation, we might say, only happened as a result of a historical moment in which Western society decided to separate itself from religion and say that religion was something anterior to or transcendent to embodied lived experience. Okay, so that is how a statement like, I am not a religious person, can make any sense. So then, what do we mean? So if we see religion as what we might say a family resemblance category, so things sort of look the same, then then we can see many different traditions kind of resembling each other in their desire to experience some kind of divinity or to experience a kind of liberation, whether it's couched in something called the divine, like it might be in Shaivism or Vedanta, or couched in something that is not necessarily divine, but is practiced like in Buddhism. Buddhism would reject something that's an absolute divinity, but what I want to say is that religion, or what religion really starts to point to, is that which organizes our sense of meaning in the world. And we all have something that organizes our sense of meaning in the world. So whether it's a conception of God, whether it's a political principle, whether it's a notion of love, whether it's an idea about science and what science can give to the world, these are values and principles that ground our very notion of connectedness with reality. They ground our understanding of the meaning of existence, right? And that, to me, is much more what religion is all about. Of course, that makes religion so broad that scholars might take issue with that. But that, to me, is a much more, if we can start to see that even in our desire for the secular, that word secular, there's been a lot of thinkers who've done a lot of work on what's called the faith in the secular, that there is actually a secular religion, and that's not to delegitimize the secular or the importance of something that we might call the secular realm, but it's to say that there is no kind of grasp on reality that is not ultimately hinged upon some kind of faith or belief system. And so that's the idea, that there is no objective place from which to determine, there is no absolute place from which to determine the objective truth of any one system of belief, whether that be religious or secular or scientific. Now there are arguments and debates. That doesn't mean we can't argue about what is a better grasp or what is a better kind of conception of the real, or what is a more effective practice to align ourselves with that kind of reality, that ambiguous sort of open-ended reality, then that conversation will always be had. So we don't want to run off into these kind of isolated realms of practice, which is sort of what happens now when we have this idea of religion as, okay, this is my religion and that's different from your religion, and these very solidified identities. That's where religion becomes problematic, when it becomes dogmatic. And Eastern wisdom is absolutely not dogmatic, at least in the way that we look to practice it at embodied philosophy. And of course, there are many takes on that somewhat might consider dogmatic. And there are those practitioners who are dogmatic about their conception of Eastern philosophy. So it's not to say that doesn't happen. A dogma doesn't pop up, where it will. All right, so in a certain sense, everyone is religious. I just want to put that out there. Everyone is religious in this kind of broader sense of religion as kind of pointing to the fundamental base belief and faith that everyone hinges their meaning of life on. Everybody gets up every day with some kind of conception of reality that they depend on, that they have faith in order to make sense of their world. So everybody is religious in that sense. And therefore, if that's the kind of religious category that we're using, then Eastern wisdom is a religion because it is a way of making sense of the meaning of our experience. Okay, my rice is burning. Take 1 second. 1 second. I'll be right back. I could smell the rice burning, and I was like, okay. So everyone is in a certain sense religious. Everyone lives in accordance with a belief system, and no belief system can be objectively verified to be superior to any other. That there can be arguments about the effective what is a better argument about reality, and those kinds of conversations should be had. But ultimately, the reflection upon religion is a secondary activity in going back to kind of the scholarship around religion. It doesn't embed itself. The reflection on religion is not embodying the religion. It's not entering religion from the inside. So statements about religion, for example, that Atman is Brahman in Vedanta, Atman is Brahman. This is a statement that if we were just to analyze it at the level of logical inquiry, it would be difficult to sustain because and of course there have been logical arguments about it, but that's not ultimately the point. Ultimately, the point is that you are meant to experience yourself as one with as Atman, as that is your true self, and that self is ultimately identified with Brahman, which is the term for that absolute eternal principle within the tradition of Vedanta. So how do you experience that? So then there are a slew of rituals and practices, particularly in meditation, that are meant to allow that statement, Atman is Brahman, to become lived and to be experienced from the inside out. So when we're just reflecting on the statements of religion from a scholarly or an analytic perspective, we are leaving out we're only getting a part of what is the language of religion. Language of religious traditions, or traditions that we might call religious in this wider sense, are not just the verbal statements that are made about them. They're not just their texts. They are also the practices and the rituals that are integrated with those texts. So you can't have one without the other. And the scholarship around our more narrow definition of religion tends to be just about the statements themselves, at least traditionally. And of course, there are, religious departments now are obviously analyzing the embodied practices as well. But still, the practice of the philosophy of religion and religious studies departments is an academic discourse. It is a verbal and written discourse. It's not entering the traditions themselves. And so there's a certain secondary way in which we cannot quite get to the heart of it if we're not embodying it. All right. So now I want to say that it's both, right? So I've sort of already said that it's both. So if religion, just to repeat, if religion is the term to point to that which organizes our sense of meaning in the world, then everybody is religious. Everybody gets up every day operating according to a certain understanding of reality and how things fit together, and that is ultimately, whether someone says, "Oh no, but that's scientific," but that belief that science sustains the meaning and the order of life is itself a belief. Whether or not the statements of science can be verified to be true or not is a separate issue. But your existential engagement with science as the foundation of the meaning of your world is religious. Is the religion in this wider sense. So if philosophy then is a mode of critical inquiry that questions and remains open to the possibility of something more than we can conceive, presently, then I would say that Eastern wisdom is a philosophy. But if philosophy is just in that narrower sense that it is often considered in academic institutions to be a kind of mode of critical inquiry that is purely intellectual, then no, it is absolutely not a philosophy in that sense. It's a philosophy in the wider sense of being a mode of inquiry that is always open to and is critically questioning, but it's not critically questioning and open purely at an intellectual level. It is open at the critical level of practice, and practice as a mode of experimentation and engagement that is keeping one ultimately vastly flexible to what is the ultimate vast openness, which is what Eastern wisdom points to as this kind of fundamental reality or lack of reality, as you would see, as the Buddhists might say. But in order to realize that through practice, one must remain fundamentally open, because if one closes oneself upon an idea about that reality or non-reality, then one has attached oneself to an idea. And Eastern wisdom is always pointing to the domain of experience, either below the threshold of the intellectual mind or above the threshold of the intellectual mind. It's pointing to something that is more than and beyond the duality of thought. And so if we close down our conception of reality to some notion, then we have attached ourselves to something that is ultimately dualistic. We have become dogmatic, and Eastern wisdom is inviting us to always frustrate those and always act against those conceptions that might close ourselves down to that ever-flowing process of critical inquiry. So I'm going to end now. I think I've talked quite enough, and I want to read. A lot of what I've said today has been inspired in part by an article by, it's called "The Category Religion Reconsidered" by James. It's called "The Category Religion Reconsidered," and it was by James M. Byrne from the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at St. Mary's University College at the University of Surrey, which is in the United Kingdom. And I'm going to read something of his which problematizes this category of religion, so sort of going back to what we were talking about earlier in the presentation. And he says, "The category religion is an artificial construct, an invention of our need to codify and contain diversity within the boundaries of identity laid down by the modern mind. So even if we acknowledge that some terms such as religion is unavoidable, within each great diversity and difference can be contained for the purpose of ease of identity," that's in parentheses, "we must not lose sight of the danger that through the use of such a category we can imply that the enormous complexity of the religious is reducible to a single element." And then he goes on to say later in the article, he actually quotes this guy Daniel Bell. Daniel Bell wrote this book called "The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism," which is an older text. But he, in the broader sense of religion that we were kind of trying to appropriate or to reimagine, he offers this: "Religion is a constitutive part of man's consciousness. The cognitive search for the pattern of the general order of existence, the affective need to establish rituals and to make such conceptions sacred, the primordial need for relatedness to some others or to a set of meanings which will establish a transcendent response to the self, and the existential need to confront the finalities of suffering and death." This is what he says. That's the end of the quote. But this is what he says is religion. So that sense of religion is more in line with the broader concept that we were kind of trying to imagine. So again, to go back to the question, is Eastern wisdom philosophy or religion? We're saying it's neither, if we're operating with those narrow definitions that philosophy and religion often get deployed as. But it's also both if we kind of force open those categories to become something more than they are often considered to be. So that's the answer to that. I'm going to look and see if there's any questions. So if you have a question, you can go ahead and write it in the comments. And if there's no questions, no problem. I'll just check here. See, I have to look into the comments. Okay, no comments. So now if you are, so I'll go ahead and I'll leave that here. And if you do have a comment, I'll check back in a second and see if anybody's sort of written down a question. But I wanted to share with you before we go off air that we're coming out with a conference. There's a little blurb at the bottom of the screen that is mentioning our upcoming online conference on Tantric Shaivism, Kundalini, and the chakras. The conference is called Radical Body, online conference. Radical Body, Living Tantra for Modern Life, which is again, an online conference exploring the teachings of Shaivism, which is something that I had mentioned, or a tradition I talked about a little bit earlier in this live stream. And it's going to be featuring 11 inspiring teachers, many of who have been interviewed for the podcast Chitheads, and you can check out that. You can check out the page and see all of these people who are going to be contributing at radicalbody.embodiedphilosophy.com, or you can check it out at the place at the bottom of the screen here, 5tapas.com/radical-body. Both of those links will take you to the same place. You can sign up there to watch the conference when it's live from February 24th to the 26th, and you will have to sign up in order to receive access to that, so do make sure you do sign up. Okay, so I'm just going to look at the comment section and see if there's anybody. No, okay, no problem. And then if you're new to Embodied Philosophy, it's an online educational platform that features a variety of writings, original writings on our blog. It also features this podcast, Chitheads. That's chit, not shit. Chit means consciousness in Sanskrit. And it explores, I interview a variety of different teachers and scholar practitioners on topics ranging from Eastern philosophy and practices, consciousness studies, and social justice and this human spiritual condition. I'm about to do a whole slew of more interviews coming up, and I'm really excited about those, so keep an eye out for that. And then there's also some video programs, Chalkboard Yoga Studies, and this video interview, Sadhaka, where I interview practitioners of all stripes, from yantra to meditation to chanting, to a variety of other things that are not immediately maybe considered yoga practices, but practices nonetheless. Okay, we got one comment. Peter, what does this understanding give us? I hate that when I click on this, when I click to see the comments, it always makes me have to listen to myself. What does this understanding give us? Such good questions you ask, Peter. So I would say that, I guess, the understanding, it's sort of the power of concepts. To me, what is fruitful or kind of liberating, I would say, about the understanding is that when many concepts we take for granted, right? Most of us take for granted the concepts of philosophy and religion and think that we have a notion of what that means. And for most of us, we don't. We don't have a knowledge of first of all how those terms are typically deployed, and then how they ultimately shape our experience. So again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but most people, when they look to Eastern wisdom practices, are seeing it as inherently religious. And if they are operating within a conception of religion that appeals to this idea of a creator God, and they might consider themselves atheists, then they would say, no, that's not for me. Whereas perhaps these practices would bring a lot to someone's life if they would allow themselves to really interact with it in a way that didn't default to these kind of narrow ideas of what religion is and what philosophy is. So on one level, I just think that the way that concepts are understood and the way that concepts are used in just a kind of wide cultural and social sense, they shape our interaction with things. They shape what we're willing to interact with. And so yeah, so in a certain sense, like, everybody's listening to this is probably already on board with Eastern wisdom, so they're not the people that are going to be, afraid of whether or not it's considered religion. So, I sort of feel like that might be part of what's inspiring your question, is sort of like, what does this give us? But I guess I feel like when I'm talking about these things, I'm sort of hoping that someone will land on this, who someone will watch this who has been opposed to something like Eastern wisdom because they think it's religious for whatever reason, and for that reason they're not interested. And so hopefully this kind of deconstruction of the concepts of philosophy and religion can open up somebody's mind a little bit and see, like, oh, okay, maybe there's something there. And for example, if somebody can see that their notion of their meaning of life is in this wider concept of religion, if somebody can see this wider notion of religion, if they can see that their meaning of life is ultimately religious in that sense, then they might be more sensitive to other things that fall under that wider category of religion, and start to get a little more, because I think one of the problems, I think, with people who consider themselves secular or scientific is they think that there is some kind of there is some kind of objectively verified position on reality that science has given us, and so the conversation around the spiritual is over, and it's been defeated by science. And this idea is really false, and it's really pervasive, I think, in the culture generally. Maybe not in the people, in yogis and Eastern spiritual practitioners, maybe not. But again, I'm trying to talk to a kind of wider audience, not just our audience. So hopefully we can kind of bring some more people into this conversation. So I don't know if that answers the question the best. For me, when we problematize concepts and look at what they mean and how they've been used historically, we're always gaining insights. I think that for me, it's incredibly useful and fruitful to understand that the term religion is a historical term. It's not a concept that has an absolute basis in reality. It rose historically at a particular historical juncture, and therefore to use it to understand something that is not so easily understood according to that category is a kind of forcing open of our understanding in a certain kind of way that I think is fruitful to practice. And so hopefully that's clear. I don't know. If you have a follow-up question, if I didn't quite get it, let me know. Yeah. So anyway, hopefully I answered that question in kind of in a more or less effective way. I'm not quite sure. So I want to close this off pretty soon. If anybody else has a question that they want to throw in, now would be the time. Otherwise, I'll close off for now. And again, if any of this stirs up stuff for you, maybe it's kind of aggravating, or maybe it's kind of clarifying, or it's sort of clarifying, but you have a question and you want to continue this conversation. That's really what I'd like all of these future live episodes on Facebook to be about, is sort of an ongoing conversation, and all of what I'm talking about really to be inspired by your questions. So please do share that with me, either in the comments, or you can send an email to hello@embodiedphilosophy.com, and we'll keep the conversation going. I think tomorrow I'm going to be talking about the body, the mind-body problem. Another question I got was, what does it mean to get into the body? And I think that when we're looking at that question, we really have to go into this mind-body dualism that has really been very integrated in our whole worldview, in our modern worldview, not just in the West, but it is, I would say most pervasive in the West. This notion of mind and body being sort of separate substances, and the kind of problems that idea creates. So I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. So go ahead and come back if this is at all interesting for you. All right, thanks, guys. Please feel free to share this with others if you know anybody that you think might benefit from this, or think that they might find it interesting, and we'll see you on the flip side. So